The incident began in Lab Block Delta 5, a cold humming corridor of polished alloy and flickering hollow panels, deep within the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Academy orbiting Gliese 581c. Students from 29 species milled through the halls, trailing behind professors and translators, some floating, some gliding, some walking, and just one, coughing. "Marcus," said the squat, lime-colored alien beside him, its voice modulated through a wrist-worn device, "is your trachea malfunctioning?" Marcus Allard wiped his nose with the back of his hand, sniffled, and gave a weak laugh. "No, Drawl, it's just a cold." Drawl's 6 eyes narrowed. "A cold what?" "A cold like rhinovirus. You know, runny nose, sore throat, maybe a fever. It's common, annoying, but not a big deal." Drawl blinked once, slowly, and then turned to the other alien students gathered around the shared bio-study bench. "Marcus Allard has contracted a pathogen. It is affecting his respiratory system. He must be quarantined." No, Marcus said, waving a hand. "I'm fine. I just need some rest and antibiotics if anything gets worse." "Antibiotics?" asked another student, a tall, translucent being named Ferrix, who had been examining Marcus's flushed face with something bordering on horror. "He is laughing. He is infected and laughing." Marcus coughed again, louder this time, and grabbed a tissue from his backpack. "Seriously, guys, I picked this up 2 days ago. It's not even bacterial, most likely, so antibiotics won't help unless I get a secondary infection. I'll just drink fluids, rest, maybe take acetaminophen." Ferrix recoiled. "He names substances as if they are charms." Before Marcus could explain further, the lab supervisor, a towering, moss-covered being called Instructor Hull, strode in, his footsteps heavy and wet. "Explain the disturbance." Drawl stood up. "Marcus Allard carries a lethal pathogen." Marcus groaned. "It's not lethal, I'm not dying." "Your core temperature is elevated," said Hull, his voice like 2 stones grinding. "Explain." Marcus sighed and unzipped his jacket. "It's a fever, 100.4 Fahrenheit. That's 38 Celsius. It's barely anything." Still, Hull summoned the Academy's medbot, who scanned Marcus from head to toe and began chirping erratically. "Subject displays signs of upper respiratory tract infection. No immediate danger. Recommend voluntary isolation and monitoring." "See?" Marcus coughed again. "No big deal." But it was too late. Word spread faster than a solar flare. By midday, Marcus had been relocated to the Academy's medical wing, isolated in a glass-walled room with negative air pressure. Drawl and Ferrix submitted a formal report to the Interstellar Health Subcouncil, claiming exposure to a lethal Terran pathogen. 3 classes were canceled. A sanitation drone team hosed down Lab Block Delta 5 with sterilizing mist. The Academy went on Level 2 containment. Marcus, lying on his cot in medical, watched all of this unfold on the room's wall screen while sipping lukewarm tea and sneezing into a tissue. "This is absurd," he muttered. A nurse drone floated in and deposited a tray with soup, electrolyte packets, and a cup of what Marcus guessed was supposed to be tea. An hour later, a delegation of alien students, led by Drawl and Ferrix, returned to the observation window. They all wore full biohazard suits. Marcus smiled weakly and waved. Ferrix pointed at him through the glass. "He is deteriorating. He has lost mass." Marcus opened the comm channel. "I've just had soup, it's fine." Drawl tilted his head. "He denies the progression of the illness. That is a symptom on some worlds." "No, seriously," Marcus said. "It's a cold. Maybe the flu, worst case sinusitis. If it turns bacterial, I'll start antibiotics. It's not some death plague." Ferrix's eyes glowed faintly. "You claim to possess substances that can neutralize this infection?" "Yeah, we call them antibiotics. Bacteria hate them." Ferrix leaned in closer. "You manufacture such weapons?" "They're not weapons. They're medicine. Penicillin, amoxicillin, azithromycin, depends on the bug." Silence fell on the intercom. Then Drawl said, "You speak of them casually, yet you are the only one of your kind here. We have never seen such substances. Marcus leaned back, tired. Because you guys don't get bacterial infections, I guess, or maybe your immune systems are different. But humans, our bodies have to deal with this stuff all the time. We've had centuries of trial and error. He coughed again, this time less violently. By the next day, Marcus's fever spiked to 101. He felt weak, his throat burned, and the medbot administered a nasal swab. The result came back, bacterial sinusitis. He groaned, "Fine, I'll take the antibiotics." The Academy's pharmacy synthesized a standard dose of amoxicillin based on his genome profile. Marcus swallowed the first pill with water, rolled over, and went to sleep. Drawl and Ferrix returned an hour later, still in suits. "How much time do you have left?" Marcus opened one eye. "What?" "Before complete internal liquefaction," Ferrix said quietly. "I've read about Terran diseases. Some melt organs." "That's Ebola," Marcus said, voice hoarse. "This is a sinus infection. I'll be back in class in 3 days. 5 if it lingers." "You ingest a compound and expect recovery?" Drawl asked. "Yes," Marcus said, blowing his nose. "Because it works." 3 days passed. Marcus took his medication every 12 hours, drank fluids, and rested. His fever broke on the 4th day. By the 5th, he was upright, pale but coherent, and cleared for light activity. When he returned to Delta 5, the students parted like mist before a fire. He sat down, cracked his neck, and opened his tablet. Where were we? Right, protein synthesis. Ferrix and Drawl stared at him from across the room. "We thought you would not return," Ferrix whispered. "I told you," Marcus said, stifling a cough. "Antibiotics clear it easily." Hall entered a moment later and paused, registering Marcus's presence. "You appear functional." "Mostly," Marcus said. "Still a little tired, that's normal." Drawl leaned over. "What is the mechanism of this? Amoxicillin?" Marcus opened his tablet, pulled up a diagram. "It inhibits bacterial cell wall synthesis. Without a wall, the bacteria can't survive. It's like dissolving their armor." Ferrix sat down slowly. "You have tools to dissolve invisible killers?" "Only some of them," Marcus said. "Others need different drugs, and viruses are a whole different story." "You face these threats regularly?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Our planet's full of them. You adapt or you die. That's how our immune systems evolved." Ferrix looked down at his hands. "We have never adapted to such aggression." "That's okay," Marcus said. "Different environments, different challenges." The rest of the class proceeded in silence, the alien students glancing at Marcus like he'd risen from the dead. By lunch, 3 more had approached him, asking about antibiotic classes, human pharmacology, and if Earth's pathogens could be weaponized. Marcus choked on his sandwich. "No. That's not why we study them. We fight diseases to save people, not to cause harm." Still, the questions continued. Over the next week, Marcus gave 3 impromptu lectures on antibiotic resistance, the danger of overprescription, and the history of penicillin. He showed them diagrams of drug mechanisms, explained gram-positive versus gram-negative bacteria, and even demonstrated how to use a microscope slide to identify pathogens. By the time his 7-day course of antibiotics ended, his symptoms were completely gone. He'd lost 2 pounds, was still a bit tired, but otherwise healthy. Drawl finally approached him alone one evening after class. "You frightened us," he said. "We thought your species was fragile. You are not." Marcus looked up from his notes. "We are, in a way, but we're used to fighting back." Drawl nodded slowly. "You fight with knowledge." "And medicine," Marcus added. "Can't forget that." Ferrix passed by, paused, then turned. "Next time you fall ill, may we observe the treatment process more closely." Marcus laughed. "Sure, but let's hope there isn't a next time too soon." He turned back to his tablet, pulled up the next assignment, and for the first time in a week, nobody treated him like a walking biohazard. By the following week, Marcus's health was fully restored, though his appetite hadn't quite caught up. He still picked at meals like someone who'd recently survived a culinary trauma. The mess hall's protein slabs didn't help, no matter how you shaped them. Food that jiggled like guilt wasn't inspiring. He was halfway through a bowl of what the dispenser claimed was nutrient-rich grain slurry when Drawl dropped into the seat across from him and placed a cube-shaped device on the table. It pulsed faintly with a soft blue light. "I require your assistance," said Drawl, staring at the cube. "Is that going to explode if I touch it?" "It is a medical interface pod for simulation." Marcus set down his spoon. "You built a flu simulator?" "Correction," said Drawl. "An analog model of Terran immunological response to bacterial infiltration, post-antibiotic exposure. I wish to observe your contribution to its calibration." "Is that why you've been borrowing biotechs from the archive every night?" "I have logged 207 hours of study since your recovery." Marcus blinked. "You know, there are easier hobbies, like juggling knives." Drawl tapped the cube and a small hologram flickered to life, a 3D rendering of a human sinus cavity under bacterial assault. Tiny rod-shaped invaders swarmed mucosal tissue, while translucent white cells darted in like angry bees. A timeline scrolled along the bottom, marking protein expression, neutrophil count, and cytokine storms with unnerving precision. "You built this from scratch?" "From your medical records and Earth's open-access materials, I extrapolated the rest." "You extrapolated cytokine dynamics?" "I estimated based on your inflammation markers at hour 36. Marcus leaned in. "You actually clocked the flare cycle?" "I graphed your fever curve against predicted macrophage activation windows. The simulation holds at 94% confidence." Marcus whistled. "Okay, that's impressive. You want me to run a few scenarios?" "I wish to determine the minimum effective antibiotic exposure required to contain bacterial replication without inducing resistance." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You're trying to optimize dosing?" "Correct. It appears your species overprescribes." "That's the understatement of the century." Drawl adjusted the projection and a new model appeared this time, simulating a different strain of bacteria. The infection advanced slower but showed a higher mutation rate. Marcus recognized it immediately. "Pseudomonas," he said. "That's a tough one." "It resisted all standard treatments in the simulation. I attempted bacteriophage therapy, but the host immune system interfered." "That's because the phages trigger their own response. You've got to use encapsulation, or the immune system neutralizes them before they reach the target." Drawl paused. "Encapsulation?" Marcus pulled out his tablet and started sketching. "Look, you wrap the phages in a lipid shell. It tricks the body into thinking they're just fat. Once they reach the infection site, enzymes dissolve the shell, and the phages go to work." Drawl took the tablet and stared at the diagram. "Your species employs deception at the molecular level. Only when honesty gets our lungs turned into soup." By the time the lunch period ended, the two had redesigned the entire treatment protocol. Drawl's cube now showed a successful elimination of the infection at 72 hours, with minimal resistance development. Marcus leaned back and stretched. "I still can't believe you did all this because I got a sinus infection. You survived a known bacterial agent with minimal intervention. That is rare." "No, it's just Tuesday." Later that evening, Marcus brought the simulation data to the Academy's medical wing, where Instructor Hull was reviewing tissue culture results under a low-intensity scanner. Marcus placed the cube on the counter. "We've been modeling bacterial resistance patterns," he said. "Thought you might be interested." Hull turned, his mossy exterior damp from the humidity chamber. "You have built a pathogen behavior engine?" "More like a drug response simulator. Drawl handled most of the computation. I just provided human context." Hull examined the display, then tapped a few controls with a thick digit. "You modeled intracellular antibiotic diffusion?" "Had to. Gram-negatives have efflux pumps. We factored in permeability dynamics." Hull's upper lip curled in what Marcus had learned was approval. "Your academic trajectory is currently undeclared." "I was leaning toward xenoanthropology." "You should reconsider. Your aptitude lies in microbial pharmacodynamics." Sure, but anthropology's where the people are. Microbes are people too. I'm not sure that's true. It is not. Hoole tapped the cube again. Still, this is useful. I will submit it to the Academy's data repository. Could we maybe not tell anyone it started because I had a runny nose? Too late. The following morning, Marcus found his seat in Delta 5 already occupied not by another student, but by a stack of data slates, each marked with a different species medical symbol. Drawl stood nearby, uncharacteristically fidgeting. Words spread, he said. About the simulation? About your immune system. Several departments submitted requests for human-derived infection scenarios. They wish to study your physiological tolerances. Marcus rubbed his temples. I'm not a lab rat. They do not require you to participate physically, only your data. I guess that's better than being poked with laser sticks. Ferrex arrived next, carrying what looked like a sealed container of spores. I brought a non-pathogenic sample from my home world. Would you be willing to demonstrate your containment techniques? Marcus looked at the container. That's not going to hatch, is it? It lacks reproductive stimuli? That's not a real answer. Still, curiosity got the best of him. He led Ferrex and Drawl to the small unused containment lab off Corridor Epsilon, where unused equipment collected dust and the environmental controls hadn't been recalibrated in months. They activated the airflow scrubbers and set up a simple exposure test. Marcus donned gloves, opened the container, and carefully isolated a sample on a slide. Under the microscope, the spore shifted colors when exposed to heat. Interesting, he said. Thermochromatic response. You use this stuff for diagnostics? Primarily agriculture, Ferrex replied. But it reacts to mammalian enzymes. Marcus added a drop of synthesized human saliva. The spores expanded slightly, then collapsed into inert fragments. Ah, enzymatic denaturing. You killed it with spit, Drawl said, awestruck. Not spit. Enzymes. Amylase, lysozyme, mucins. Our mouths are like chemical war zones. Ferrex seemed shaken. That was a resilient organism. We've been chewing on food, crawling with microbes since before we had tools. Evolution didn't give us much choice. They spent the next 2 hours running tests, cataloging reactions, and submitting the data to the Academy's shared research hub. Marcus was surprised when a notification pinged on his tablet, preliminary approval for an independent research module. Later that day, while walking back to his dorm, he was intercepted by a towering insectoid named Relac, one of the Academy's visiting specialists in environmental biology. Without preamble, Relac extended a chitin-covered arm and handed Marcus a sealed container. This is a xenobacterium from the ringed moon of Hecta 7, Relac said. It resists ion sterilization and consumes carbon scaffolds. Okay, and you want me to do what? Survive it. Marcus stared. I'm not licking it. We wish to test enzyme compatibility with Terran antibiotics. I'll run simulations, not clinical trials. Relac's antennae twitched. Acceptable. By the end of the week, Marcus had become an unwilling celebrity among the bioengineering circles. He taught 2 impromptu workshops on gut-flora balance, helped a third-year student model a synthetic antibody, and found a note stuck to his dorm door offering unlimited nutrient credits in exchange for a sample of your intestinal microbiota. He tossed the note in the recycler. At breakfast the next morning, Ferrex sat down beside him, holding a tray of what looked like gelatin-wrapped pebbles. I have begun cultivating artificial microbiomes, he said, based on yours. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. It may help species with sterile digestive tracts. Yours is uniquely adaptable. Marcus picked up his tea. If this ends with someone trying to clone my colon, I'm filing an ethics complaint. You should be proud, Drawl said, arriving with a portable scanner. Your body is a battlefield, and it wins. Marcus sipped his tea. Yeah, but I still miss chicken soup. And for the first time in Academy history, the cafeteria offered it the next day, under the label Human Comfort Broth, Caution, contains protein. It was 2 weeks after the infamous sinus incident, and Marcus Allard had finally been moved out of the biohazard-adjacent dormitory wing and reinstated to full-class status. His vitals were logged daily by the MedWing's auto-monitor, but no further incidents had cropped up, unless one counted the unsolicited probiotic pastries Ferrix had begun leaving near his locker. At precisely third cycle midday, Marcus was summoned to the Academy's primary lecture sphere, an enormous amphitheater, suspended by magnetic tension between 3 structural arms, where faculty rarely gathered unless something serious or deeply inconvenient had occurred. He found himself led there not by a faculty bot or his advisor, but by Instructor Hull himself. "You are requested for a demonstration," Hull said, not slowing his pace as Marcus jogged to keep up. "Several departments have convened to observe." "I'm not doing another simulation if that's what this is," Marcus replied. "I've helped with 4 already. One of them tried to 3D print my spleen." "This is not simulation," said Hull. "It is instructional, practical. You are the example." As they entered the sphere, Marcus spotted over 40 researchers and students from various species, seated in tiered rings. A few wore translation halos, others simply observed in silence, their attention focused on a central, glass-paled enclosure displaying a patient reclined on a diagnostic slab. The patient, a humanoid with opalescent skin and a long, ridged nasal bridge, was clearly in discomfort, flanked by 2 medical drones humming nervously. "Who is that?" "Exchange student from the Corellian delegation. They encountered a terrestrial bacterium during a soil interface project. Our antimicrobial protocols failed. You have familiarity with the organism." "What kind?" "Streptococcus pyogenes?" Marcus winced. "That's not a soil bacterium. What were they doing, licking it?" "Unknown. But they are now exhibiting signs of acute pharyngitis and lymph node inflammation." "And you want me to, diagnose them?" "We wish you to explain your species' treatment methodology to the assembly while applying it. Under observation?" Marcus stared at the crowd. "You want me to walk an alien through strep throat treatment in front of an interstellar audience? You are the only qualified individual on this orbital facility with both the susceptibility history and first-hand recovery from a related infection. That's not the same as a medical license. Your oral flora is more instructive than any credential." Marcus sighed, stepped forward, and addressed the medical system. "Vitals?" The med drone displayed the data: elevated temperature, inflamed tonsils with exudate, tachycardia, no signs of systemic spread. The patient's immune markers were spiking in a familiar pattern. "Have you confirmed the strain with a rapid antigen test?" "We lack one calibrated for Kirilian mucosal chemistry." Marcus pointed to the control panel. "Run a culture on blood agar. Incubate at 37 Celsius. Look for beta hemolysis in 24 hours. "The patient may not survive that long without intervention," said a silver-skinned researcher with a cluster of islets along their brow. "They are already experiencing airway constriction." Marcus turned to the drones. "Do we have cephalexin or penicillin V in the inventory?" "Penicillin V is incompatible with their enzymatic profile," the drone replied. "Cephalexin may be tolerated. Then dose orally with cefalexin 500 milligrams twice daily. Monitor renal clearance. Corellians have a lower glomerular filtration rate." The crowd murmured. Marcus turned to them. "This isn't magic. You have to adjust for metabolic rate, protein binding, and excretion. Cephalexin is broad spectrum and targets gram-positive cocci effectively. Don't throw entire pharmacological catalogs at a bug that folds from a single punch." The Corellian patient swallowed the capsule with visible effort. Within minutes, their breathing improved marginally as the inflammation subsided slightly. A placebo effect, most likely, but comforting nonetheless. Marcus spoke again. "You're treating symptoms until the drug kicks in. That takes time. Don't expect miracles in an hour. The bacterial cell wall has to weaken, the immune system has to catch up, and the patient has to rest." One of the observers, a gelatinous being with a shimmering carapace, raised a pseudopod. "Your species survives these infections unaided?" "Sometimes." But we've also had centuries to figure out which drugs work and which ones don't. It's not just survival, it's pattern recognition. We've cataloged the terrain. Another researcher asked, "Do you ever fail?" "Constantly," Marcus said. "That's why we track resistance, we rotate antibiotics, we revise protocols. The moment you assume you've won, the bacteria evolve. They're fast, we just try to be faster." The murmuring ceased. One by one, the researchers began filing out, taking notes, whispering to their assistants. Marcus remained by the patient's side until their breathing evened out and the drones adjusted the humidity fields. Later that cycle, he returned to his dorm to find a message waiting outside his door. Not a digital ping or a data slate, but a physical envelope, rare at the academy. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, fibrous paper. "You have altered the treatment approach for 17 active cases. We request your participation in the Academy's Cross-Species Pharmacology Advisory Board. Your methodology is unorthodox, but effective. Congratulations." Attached was a full research badge, granting him access to restricted labs and advanced biointerface equipment. He stared at it for a long time before tossing it on his desk and collapsing onto his bunk. By the next morning, Marcus found his schedule had been altered. 3 of his general ed classes had been replaced with lab rotations. He was now listed as an interdisciplinary advisor for the Xenomedical Initiative. In Biolab Theta, he met with a group of second-level students who had been engineering synthetic enzyme analogs. One of them, a quadrupedal insectoid with a translucent thorax, presented a polymer they claimed mimicked human lactoferrin. Marcus examined the structure. "This won't bind iron properly. Your chelation site is asymmetric. We modeled it on your saliva. Then you got the wrong protein. Lactoferin's not the same as mucin. Try adding a histidine loop here." They adjusted the model. The new structure folded correctly under simulation. The student blinked their secondary eyes in surprise. Marcus moved to the next station, where a duo of amphibious researchers were testing topical antimicrobials. "You know," he said, watching a fungal colony recede under fluorescent gel, "we had to invent this kind of stuff because we kept dying from infected scrapes. We didn't do it out of brilliance, just desperation." An instructor nearby looked over. "And yet you teach us one compound at a time without arrogance." "We're not special," Marcus said, "just stubborn." By the following week, the Corellian patient had recovered completely. They approached Marcus in the corridor, handed him a small, folded cloth embroidered with a lunar crest. "This is a token of thanks," they said. "Our species does not recover from foreign pathogens easily." "Keep the cloth," Marcus said. "Just wash your hands more often." The Corellians smiled with their inner eyelids. "We've begun sterilizing our research tools using your ethanol formula. Just don't start drinking it." They parted ways and Marcus continued down the corridor, his badge now opening doors that once ignored him. He passed a group of new arrivals, young students from a distant system, chattering nervously in their native tones. One paused as he walked by. "Are you the human who cured the plague?" Marcus stopped. "It wasn't a plague, just strep." The student looked confused. "It sounded worse in the reports." "It always does." He kept walking, not bothering to explain further. There was a lab to check on, a dose-response graph to calibrate, and a culture dish waiting to be examined. That night, as he sat eating a bowl of anonymously labeled stew, Drawl joined him without preamble. "I observed your lecture," Drool said. "It caused a departmental shift." "Yeah, I noticed. My inbox exploded." "You are now cited in 42 documents. I hope none of them say I'm a genius." "Only a few." Marcus stabbed at a suspiciously soft vegetable. "Honestly, I just didn't want the guy to suffocate from tonsillitis." Drawl watched him for a moment. "You are very efficient at making survival appear casual. Don't mistake familiarity for invincibility." "I do not. But I admire it." Marcus looked up. "Then let's make sure nobody else ends up in that glass box again." Drawl nodded once. "Agreed." And for the first time since arriving at the academy, Marcus felt something settle, not prestige, not fame, but the quiet satisfaction of turning chaos into routine. even if that routine involved explaining sore throats to species that didn't have throats. He finished his meal and returned to the lab, where the next round of experiments waited. Because somewhere, someone would get sick again, and now they'd know what to do.